your most recent piece was about Biden tearing his coalition apart, and you compare what's happening with Biden um, and contrast, I guess, with FDR and LBJ, and sort of like place this moment. Just walk us through that. It basically centers around the idea of guns and butter.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, there's a kind of classic question in economics: can you have both guns and butter? And it's sort of, like many questions, depends on when. And I think, FDR, the sort of most important American president of the last century, was able to kind of have guns and butter, but under the very special circumstances that you first had the Great Depression, which the nation flat on the back, and then World War II, and you had to, like, basically defeat Nazism, which is very important to do. And within that context of, the nation really needing a lot of stimulus, was able to do sort of like a guns and butter program, Social Security, but also, making America into a superpower. Now, the thing is, after that, it becomes a dilemma, because once you're like at a healthier economy, you kind of have to choose. There's only so much resources to go around, and I think it's an unfortunate and tragic choice that after Roosevelt, the sort of presidents that came in, starting with Truman, but really coming to a peak with Lyndon Johnson, basically thought that they could like square the circle by something that scholars call military Keynesianism. So this is basically the idea that you can get the sort of Keynesian stimulus by just spending a lot of money on the military, and that's gonna so you can get both, right? Truman did it with the big sort of arms buildup for the Korean War, and Lyndon Johnson tried to do the same thing. The problem is, once you're at full economy, if you do that, you're going to get like inflation, and you're going to get all sorts of destabilizations in the system. And that's kind of what happened with Lyndon Johnson. I mean, in addition to all the moral atrocity of the Vietnam War, there's simply the fact that he really created a lot of budgetary and inflation problems that really came back to bite the Democrats in the ass, and created the precondition for all the austerity of the 1970s. And like Biden, his mind is really in 1963. Like, I don't think his mind has changed since then, and he's trying to replicate what Lyndon Johnson is doing.
Well, I'll tell you, so I'm a little skeptical from the economic perspective that we can't have guns and butter now, because I mean, because the I mean, just our monetary system works differently than in those two occasions. But to me, the problem is from a political standpoint, in terms of the coalition that Biden needs to defeat Trump, and the Democrats really need to defeat the Republicans. This idea of what's going on in Israel, and that's sort of like maybe the open-endedness. I think there's a lot more play in terms of the Ukraine issue, and I'm speaking only from a political standpoint. Let's for a moment,
Sure.
put aside these other issues, but within the context of the coalition, it feels like this is much more problematic in terms of like the political notions than certainly for FDR and arguably for LBJ.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, I think LBJ, when he was starting out in 64, 65, there wasn't a big anti-war movement, but he certainly helped create it, right? And he certainly and that led to like real political dilemma for people like Martin Luther King Jr., where, obviously he was very supportive of the Great Society and the Civil Rights Act, but then he found himself he had to break with Lyndon Johnson and say the Vietnam War is too much. That's a hard thing to do, to break with a president that has given you stuff that you want. And Biden has recreated that dilemma. Biden is no Lyndon Johnson or Franklin Roosevelt, but actually, in terms of what he's given us, it's more than any Democrat since Lyndon Johnson, right? He has actually really made some good interventions in the economy, especially on climate. But are people gonna buy the bargain that he's selling them? Which is if you want my economic policies, you have to also buy blowing up hospitals in Gaza. well, I don't know how many people are going to do that. Like Martin Luther King Jr. did not accept the idea that, if he wanted the Civil Rights Act, he had to like accept firebombing Hanoi. And like at some point, like people within your coalition, people who are like don't want unjust wars, are going to break with you, so in that sense, Biden has recreated the problem.
Well, the coalition here is, I think, key, right? Because I think before October 7th and before Israel's, genocidal response, as scholars are determining it here, if they are not stopped, like there was, I would say, a significant path forward with a fairly robust coalition where you could have taken away a lot from these recent elections, where you could ride abortion to a victory, even if the person at the top of the ticket people are largely ambivalent about. You would be able to have a coalition of young people motivated to vote against Trump via negative partisanship, more like 2020, as opposed to staying home and depressing that kind of turnout, getting Democratic partisans, traditional voters, plus young people who don't want to see Trump in office. So more of a replication of 2020 with high turnout. Biden desperately needs high turnout, right? And that is a major problem if you're going to depress some percentage of the population who doesn't want to sign on to what many young people honestly feel is a genocide. And you can say, like, that's not rational. Trump is worse. I agree, Trump is worse. But that's not going to be persuasive in getting many people to vote, right? Because you can't. We know this time and time again. You can't browbeat people into voting in the way that they should. It's all about how people respond emotionally to these things.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And people, it's not just a matter of emotion. Like I think people are right to kind of like draw a line. Like
Sure.
I mean, like as I said, I go back to the King dilemma. Like like Lyndon Johnson gave the American left like almost everything they could have wanted. But like if you're like destroying whole villages in Vietnam, like how can you sign on for that? How can you think of yourself as a moral person if you make that devil's bargain? And people don't. Are very upset at this, and for good reasons. It's an interesting question. Like if this war hadn't broken up, I do think you're right that the coalition could have kept together. I still have questions about the guns and butters things because I actually think that you have to have some priority in government spending. I think what Biden and Jake Sullivan and Blinken are thinking is they can recreate the Cold War. They can recreate the idea that we have to fight China, so we're going to get Republicans on board to finance a lot of infrastructure spending, a lot of scientific research, and we'll get rid of the gridlock. I don't think that would work. I don't think Republicans are on board for that. We certainly already saw that with Ukraine spending. And I actually don't think if you think about what the priorities we actually need to spend money on building solar panels. We need to build a Green New Deal, and you don't get a Green New Deal by funding the Pentagon to $1 trillion. That's just not the path forward.
What do you think? I mean, there are cables now coming in from ambassadors in the Middle East, U.S. ambassadors that are being leaked, saying that this is, they're appalled and sort of shocked at what Biden's doing. There are 1,000 State Department workers essentially who are, releasing letters type of situation. And there was this piece in the Huffington Post today about congressional members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress, sort of completely caught off guard about the politics here. I just want to read this one graph from it. Another staffer said it did not occur to her superiors that some constituents would have personal ties to Gaza, which she realized when a caller said the bombardment had just killed most of his friend's family. The statement we're authorized to use doesn't contain any sympathy, the staffer said. It isn't part of any statement to say, I'm sorry that happened to you. She went off script to tell the caller she was sorry. An astounding number of callers say they are committed to never voting for their member again unless they support a ceasefire, several staffers said. Some constituents even promised to go further and mobilize friends and neighbors to vote against them. Some members equally fervent in believing this will blow over. It really feels, I mean, just, again, strictly as a political matter, that the president and Democratic leaders in the Senate, Bernie Sanders, and members of Congress really had maybe no sense of how committed Netanyahu was to staying in office, which means ongoing killing until people forget that he should, be going to jail, and that there would be this kind of reaction from the American public.
Yeah, no, I think one way to see this, the prism to use, is gerontocracy. That like the sort of the president, the Senate, and the Congress are like much older than the American people, and that's more true of the Democrats than of the Republicans. And so I think that a lot of these people, their mental universe is like 1967 or 1973, when there was kind of like very strong, full throttled American support. And among older people, there is more of that. But like among younger people, like if you're under like 30 or under 40, the only Israel you've ever known is Netanyahu and Sharon, right?
Yeah.
Like the only Israel you've ever known is the one that's bombing Gaza. And certainly like younger people especially have a lot more friends that are like multicultural, coming from different backgrounds, and just have are more in line with the rest of the world, really. So you have a sort of democratic leadership that like was totally caught off guard by the fact that like a large part of their base, their constituency, is not on board of this. There's overwhelming support among Democratic voters for a ceasefire, and more broadly for an even-handed approach, for the United States being even-handed. I honestly think there's possible explanations of like donor class and stuff like that, but I honestly think the explanation is that Biden and unfortunately Bernie Sanders are living in a mental universe that is far in the past.
Yes, and you also see that in the coalition of those who are supporting a ceasefire in the House. Not one white member is supporting a ceasefire. It is all progressive POCs who are behind a ceasefire at this point. And like, is there any kind of pause from the gerontocracy to understand, like, are we racist? Are we racist? Like, are we discounting the views of Black and brown people in this country who feel an intrinsic kind of solidarity with Palestine and what they've experienced? And is it because they're just all anti-Semitic all of a sudden? Or is it because they see something in the Palestinian people that is reflected in their own domestic experiences or the experiences of their ancestors or their family?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. There is a very sharp kind of racial divide, which ties in with the generational divide, with people of color being generally younger. And yeah, I just don't think the lived experience of like the actual voters that the Democrats need is apparent to like most members of Congress, except and then this might bring us to the next point, through their staff. Like they do have staff that is much younger, and even in the State Department, they are like younger people, and so I think you're seeing an interesting sort of mutiny within the sort of lanyard class, like the people who are like within the establishment at the bottom rungs of the ladder are kind of like they're really not on board with this.